Welcome to Aspen Leading Edge. I'm Patty Roberts from St. Mary's University School of Law, and today's guest is Dean Erwin Chemerinsky. He is the 13th Dean of Berkeley Law, a position he started in 2017. And he was, prior to that, founding dean and distinguished professor of law at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. Welcome, Dean Chemerinsky.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to talk with you.
Well, thank you. I am, of course, in awe of speaking with you in this particular moment. You are a fellow podcaster, and so it's always good to talk to someone else who uses this medium. But then there's so many things that you are doing in the academy, and that the rest of us learn from you regarding that. This is an exciting episode for me. So you're wrapping up your presidency of AALS. That's got to be a big relief, but also it was a huge accomplishment. Tell us a little bit about that.
It's been a tremendous honor to be the president of the Association of American Law Schools. I looked at those who've been in this role previously. There's some of the giants in legal education over the last century. I really felt like I was the answer to the sesame question, which of these doesn't belong? There's so much that's been exciting about being part of AALS in this role. We've created a number of new programs. We've created programs now that AALS does online for lecturers and adjunct faculty. These are individuals who can't come to the AALS conference, and yet many schools don't have sufficient number of resources to provide training in pedagogy. We've created programs for retired faculty, those who often don't, again, have programs that are oriented towards them and who often also can't come to AALS. I've had certain things that I've really wanted to focus on. I want AALS to get much more involved in pipeline programs, encouraging high school and college students to be involved in law school. So there have been studies that have been done, including one by AALS before the JD, that shows so many people choose whether to go to law school prior to ever getting to college. And often those who are like me from first generation of college families just don't have the information. I think that I chose as my theme for this year of AALS, how law schools can make a difference. And I'm very excited to see many panels at the annual conference that will focus on that topic.
Well, as a fellow dean, I want to thank you for some of the new initiatives that you and AALS have embarked on. I have been so excited to see the programming for adjunct faculty and for retired faculty. I mean, those are just schools don't have enough resources, as you know, to provide that kind of regularized training. So that's been a huge help. And law schools making a difference. We've seen that after the January 6th riot. I know that many of you have contributed to a book that talks about protecting the rule of law and democracy. And so thank you for that theme. And it's exciting to see it play out. A lot more collaboration among law schools, too, which I think is a direct result of your theme.
I hope so. And I've got to say, one of the great joys of being president of AALS is the chance to work with Judy Areen, who's the executive director, and the AALS staff. Until I became involved, I didn't realize all the things that AALS did. And I also didn't realize how terrific Judy and her staff are.
They really are amazing. Looking forward to the conference that's coming up. Now, is there a role that you play as past president? Will you have some additional responsibilities this coming year?
One of the wonderful things upon becoming past president on January 7th is there are no official duties for a past president. It's been great to be president-elect and president, but Mark Alexander will be the new president, and he will do a terrific job. The past president is part of a leadership council that includes the president-elect, the president, and the immediate past president. And the past president serves for a year on the executive committee. So there'll certainly still be involvement, but I'm delighted to turn the so-called reins over to Mark.
Yes. Well, and I know he's already getting going on that. I've received emails from him myself, but he will do a great job. And I'm glad that your duties will subside a bit because you are incredibly busy. I don't know how you do all the things that you do. In fact, in talking with you prior to this, I don't know how you sleep, but you have so many good projects that are coming out that will be available to help law students. Your treatise has a new edition coming out, the Constitutional Law Principles and Policy. That'll be a 7th edition, and that's going to cover the end of last term. So we know that that will include Dobbs and the many changes there. You're co-authoring a new federal courts casebook. That'll be a 1st edition. And then revising the con law casebooks, also a 7th edition, that'll be ready in spring 2024 and will include the 2023 term. So tell us, how did you approach all of these new volumes that obviously have so many significant changes in constitutional law, and what can we look for in these new volumes?
Sure. Just to go back a little bit, I was a relatively new law professor. I just had gotten tenure at the University of Southern California and thought that there really needs to be a federal jurisdiction treatise that matches up with what's covered in federal courts classes. And it was then Little Brown, what's since become Aspen, and they send representatives around. And I said, do you think that your company would have interest in doing such a treatise? And he then had the acquisitions manager meet with me. And in the spring of 1986, I signed the contract to do the federal jurisdiction treatise, which is now in its 8th edition. And that's led to a number of other books with Aspen and its predecessor incarnations. I have to tell you, from an author's perspective, I could not have a better working relationship with a publisher than it's been with Aspen. And you mentioned 3 projects that are in various stages now. One is the new edition of the Constitutional Law Treatise, Principles and Policies. It's done. We're done with paid proofs and copy editing, so I expect it'll be out very early in 2023. And it is current through the end of the last term of the court, through June of 2022. And obviously there's major sections that are brand new, like on abortion and guns and church and state. I'm very honored to be the co-author of a 1st edition of a new casebook on federal courts. It's with Seth Davis from Berkeley, Norm Spalding from Stanford, and Fred Smith from Emory University. And I think it takes a much more modern approach and much more of a contextual approach to looking at federal courts. And I've been teaching federal courts for a long time. And for the first time, I'll have a casebook I really want to teach from. And it's time for a new edition of the Con Law Casebook. And as you say, this will be the 7th edition. And I think it's time for a pretty major overhaul, including because the law has changed a lot. And the goal is to get that manuscript in by the end of summer, so it'll be ready for classes, hopefully for spring of 2024.
Well, that's really exciting. And how are these volumes addressing the changes like those that are included in Dobbs? Is there any sort of policy discussions that you've integrated, or some predictive material that you've included? How have you approached that as an author?
My goal in my con law treatise and my con law casebook is to be as ideologically neutral as I can be. And I'm always gratified when I hear from very conservative professors that they use these books and are very comfortable with them. I have plenty of other venues to express my opinion, but that's not what I want to do here. In the treatise, what I want to do is state the law as clearly as I can and present both sides. And that's what I tried to do with regard to abortion before Dobbs and in the new edition. And with regard to the casebook, my goal was to make it as student-friendly as possible. So it's cases, it's more brief excerpts of cases, and it's essays about them. And again, I want the students to be able to see both sides, but I try not to make them in any way advocacy and try not to have any ideological bias. I can't say that I don't have views and it doesn't creep in, but I sure try hard to make it ideologically neutral.
Well, I love hearing that. And of course, that's part of what is causing a great furor, the lack of some ideological neutrality that we may be seeing nationally. And I noticed this morning that you were quoted as having said, law schools have to be places where all ideas and views are expressed. And you mentioned students facing subtle pressure from classmates to withhold certain views. Can you talk a little bit more about your thoughts related to free speech in our law schools?
I deeply believe that law schools and more generally universities have to be places where all ideas and views can be expressed. I want my law school to be a place where conservative speakers are comfortable. And we've had them this semester. We've had Ilya Shapiro and David Bernstein and Randy Barnett come. And I also want to be a place where liberal speakers can come. And I can certainly list all of the liberals. David Cole from the ACLU is coming in February. And I have very much defended on our campus the ability of people like Ann Coulter to come speak, but also the ability of liberals to come speak. I think that's what a campus should be about. I do worry that there are pressures within the classroom that silence some students. And I constantly think about what are the ways in which I can address this directly. The first day of the class talk about why it's so important that all views be expressed, that students, as they go into practice, need to know what the arguments are on the other side so they're prepared. But yet I still worry, and I have recent experience that confirms this concern. 2 years ago, in spring 2021, all our classes were online. I taught constitutional law to a large class online, and I let students participate either by raising their hand or by writing in the chat. And I was the only one who would see what was written in the chat. And I would read aloud whatever they wrote without attribution to them. I got more conservative comments than I've ever gotten in recent years in the classroom discussion. I taught the same class last spring of 2022, and didn't have nearly as many conservative views expressed. I think that tells us something important, and I wish I had better ways to deal with it in the classroom.
That's really very interesting. And I'm not surprised because I do think there's a silencing of viewpoints that's happening. How do we as leaders in law schools and higher education generally combat this feeling among some students that they can't be heard safely? How do you get to that place with your students?
I think it's so important that we as deans articulate our values for the institution. And I look for many occasions to express why it's so important that all views be able to be expressed. In orientation, I talk about this. I address it directly and say that if students silence others by what they say on social media about one another, all of them are then losing in their education. I send a message to the whole school at the beginning of the school year, expressing my views and what I hope are our values with regard to freedom of speech. In each class I teach, talk about it the first day, and I look for other ways to reinforce the message. But it's difficult at this point in time, and not all students agree with me, not all faculty agree with me.
I know we regularly get the inquiry from students. I don't just mean at my institution, but nationally, students will say, well, this person said this thing in class that was unfair, or that was biased, or that was discriminatory, and you, the professor, didn't do anything about it. What do you think the role is of the professor in those instances where something is said that is heard as harmful by others?
It depends on what it is. It's very hard to generalize. If ever a student used a slur or an epithet, I would respond immediately and say that this is inappropriate. I once was teaching, it was actually a legal ethics class a long time ago, and we were talking about negotiation. And a student in the class said, and I'm going to quote, though it's offensive to say, the other side's going to, quote, try to Jew you down. And I immediately sat and said, I know you didn't mean that in an offensive way, but it is taken by many as offensive. And I explained why. And the student apologized. But I felt at that moment I had to speak up, and I need to explain why it was offensive. If it's an ideological position, if it's an unpopular ideological position, I'll defend the right of the student to express that because I want the viewpoint to be there. So I want students to be able to criticize affirmative action. I want students to be able to speak against abortion rights. And I will defend anyone who says that the students have said something inappropriate in that way. But that's why I think it's very hard to generalize. So much depends on what's said and what's the context in which it's said.
Absolutely. I think you've made a great distinction there, and good for you for addressing the slur in the way that you did right away. As far as our civil discourse that many are talking about as being not so civil, and the way that some sides are silenced and other sides are attacked when they do say their viewpoints, ideological viewpoints. Have you found ways at Berkeley, other than your own modeling and leadership, to create those opportunities for conversation of diverse viewpoints? Do you have suggestions for other institutions grappling with this?
I think what's most important is to have ideologically diverse faculty and ideologically diverse student groups, because ultimately that's what's going to produce the dialogue within the law school. And it's going to do so much more than anything I can do as dean. Now, there's certainly things that I can do as dean. I mentioned some. There are a limited number of speakers that the dean's office invites. We have a few endowed lectures. I try to be attentive to that in having ideologically diverse speakers there. I try to make sure in terms of the school's financial support that we provide it across the ideological spectrum. But again, I think that it's what the professors are doing and what the student groups are doing, and we have many centers and what they're doing, that much more shapes the discourse in the law school than anything a dean can do on his or her own.
So I'm going to change gears a little bit here. I look at where we are in legal education, and since I started myself as dean in 2020, so we got through a pandemic, and now in this one moment in time, the ABA is considering removing the requirement for the LSAT. Many schools, including your own, have gone away from participating in the rankings, at least for this year. And then, of course, we have the affirmative action case that's about to come out. How do you see these things playing out as far as their impact on legal education nationally? Do you see this as a really stunning moment with lots of change coming, or do you see this as more just speed bumps?
I think I see this as a time of a lot of change coming. Let me go in reverse order of what you say. I think the most important of these is that the Supreme Court is poised to eliminate affirmative action in higher education. The two cases were argued on October 31st, and I don't think anyone, liberal or conservatives, doubt that the Supreme Court's going to overrule Bakke and Grutter and Fisher. Some states like California have already done this, and we can learn from their experience. It's been quite devastating with regard to diversity. California voters in 1996 passed Proposition 209 that eliminated affirmative action. If you compare diversity statistics, say from 1995 to 1998, the year before it passed and 2 years after, the number of Black and Latinx freshmen at UCLA and Berkeley decreased by 50%. In the year after Prop 209, there was only one Black entering student at Berkeley Law, and that's somebody who admitted earlier and deferred admission. UCLA didn't get back to its pre-1996 levels of undergraduate diversity for 19 years until 2015. So I think law schools and college universities that have engaging in affirmative action are going to need to confront how do you achieve diversity without it. In fact, the AALS is going to do a program for law school deans and admissions officers on July 10th, focusing on exactly this topic.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. That's wonderful.
A second thing that you mentioned was the proposed change in ABA standards changing standard 503 so that law schools will now required to use a standardized test. I was one of 60 deans who sent a letter to the ABA saying it was premature to take this step. I really worry about what the effect is going to be on diversity. What is going to take the place of the LSAT? Is it going to be more emphasis on undergraduate grades? Well, what will be the impact of that? I worry for first-generation students. They often struggle the first couple of years of college. Will relying on just undergraduate grades be to their detriment? Will it be relying more on letters of recommendation or personal statements or interviews? There's a lot of evidence that those are so subjective that they too might have an adverse effect on diversity. So my position isn't in favor of standardized tests. My position is that I wish the ABA would be cautious about changing this in a way to a better sense of what's it going to mean for law schools and diversity. But I think it's a done deal. I think the ABA is likely to adopt the recommendation of the council and eliminate standardized tests. And I think that's going to create enormous uncertainty about what happens next.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of U.S. News, I've been complaining to U.S. News for a decade about certain things. I went to Washington almost 10 years ago to meet with Bob Morse and others on his staff to object to their not including school-funded fellowships as fully employed individuals. I wrote him about this again, 2 letters as recently as this spring. I wrote him this spring complaining that students who are in PhD or MBA programs don't count as fully employed. I wrote him a couple of years ago complaining about how they calculate per student expenditures and discount it by a cost of living. So when Yale announced the Wednesday, the week before Thanksgiving, that it was withdrawing from the rankings, and then Harvard announced that day, I felt strongly that Berkeley needed to be a leader. And I convened my senior administrative team that afternoon. And I wrote to my chancellor because I didn't want to do anything without her permission. And I admire her greatly. Berkeley does well overall in the rankings. U.S. News just did an international ranking of universities, and Berkeley was number 4 in the world. And most
Wow.
departments and schools are in the top 5. And to her credit, Carol Crisp wrote me back in 5 minutes and said, I support you withdrawing from U.S. News. And then on Thursday morning, we became the 3rd school to announce we weren't going to cooperate and participate. And then many schools have followed since.
Well, I do appreciate Berkeley's leadership. When I saw a notice of Yale stepping out, I immediately wrote to Dean Gerken and thanked her for, demonstrating that leadership that I think has given a lot of opportunity to the rest of us to make these decisions moving forward. But thank you for doing that. Yes, a lot of change afoot with how admissions will happen and how students will consider our institutions. It makes it even more important that these pipeline programs that you indicated, AALS, and I know many of our law schools are engaging in much earlier so that we can increase the diversity of our profession. So let's talk a little bit about Berkeley. So we talked about Berkeley's leadership with U.S. News. I just received notice that you received a $5.5 million gift that will create an additional faculty position at the school called the Barry Tarlow Chair in Criminal Justice. Now that's an exciting Christmas gift. Tell us a little bit about that.
It is. As a dean, you know that gifts like this are rare and incredibly special and important. Barry Tarlow is a very prominent criminal defense lawyer in Los Angeles. I taught at USC for 21 years, so got to know him during that time. In fact, there was a major trial where he was the trial lawyer, and then I handled the appeal in the Ninth Circuit, so got to work with him. And I was thrilled when his widow, Marcia Morrissey, directed the gift to Berkeley. It's $5.5 million to create the Barry Tarlow Chair in Criminal Justice. And then it's an additional gift, about $200,000 to help support our death penalty clinic.
Oh, that's extraordinary. Really, really wonderful work. That's so great. Congratulations to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
What a legacy that he's leaving.
It's terrific. And I've identified a wonderful member of our faculty who I just think epitomizes what Barry Tarlow stood for.
Well, we've talked about so many things during our conversation today, and I appreciate your insight and your candor. And I wrap up my podcast episodes with the following question. And I think you've given us some view of the future, but in the coming decade, how do you anticipate that legal education is going to evolve?
I think the honest answer is we can't know at this point in time. Who could have imagined the pandemic that would have so shaped legal education over the last few years? And we've already talked about major changes that are going to affect law schools through affirmative action, the LSAT, and US News. I mean, the easy answer is that 10 years from now, law school education is going to look a lot like it does now, which looks a lot like it did 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 30 years, or 40 years ago. But I think that there's going to continue to be changes with regard to curriculum. And I think of the courses that now are so important that didn't even exist when you and I were in law school because of changes in technology. I think a lot is always going to depend on the economy. I think one virtue of you and I having done this a while is we've seen applications go up and we've seen applications go down. And that's likely to happen again over the course of the next decade. But society continues to need great lawyers, so it continues to need wonderful law schools to train them.
Yes, it absolutely does. And so proud to be part of one and enjoyed hearing more about your experience at Berkeley. So you've talked about your new editions, and I know that if anybody is interested in the new treatise, the 7th edition, or the Fed Courts Casebook, or the Con Law Casebook 7th edition, they can find that at aspenpublishing.com. But thank you so much for sharing your views. Thank you for your leadership as a law school dean, and thank you for your leadership of AALS